In the name of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I don't want to make a habit of quoting the Prime Minister at the beginning of every sermon. I did it last week, I'm going to do it this week, but I promise I won't do it again. But it just so graphically illustrates the gospel story that we have before us. If you think that sounds a little unfair, says the PM, excuse me, don't worry. There is a good reason for it, according to the Prime Minister, because the harder people work, the more they earn. The more they keep of what they earn. The harder people work, the more they earn, the more they keep of what they earn. Then he goes on to say, people earn $200,000 or more because they work harder. The top 5% of income earners in this country just put in more hours and make more effort than the other 95% of us. Tell that to a nurse on $60,000 a year, or a teacher, or a poor old parson like me putting in 100 hours a week. The amount of money we earn has absolutely no correlation to the amount of effort that we actually put in. We have this story before us today of the what's called the rich fool, the man who realises he has so much abundance, and his response to having that realisation is he'll tear down his old barns. They're not big enough. He'll build new barns and hoard his wealth. Back in the Great Depression, when President Hoover in America was the President of the United States, he had this idea that the way to stimulate the economy was to give the wealthy tax cuts. This is not a new idea. This has been going on for a very long time, and the way that he would stimulate the economy was to give the rich more money, and the idea was that it would trickle down to the poor. The idea of the trickle-down economy was first coined in the Great Depression by the commentator and comedian, interestingly a comedian would say this, by the name of Will Rogers. And Will Rogers said this: "The money was all appropriated for the top in the hopes that it would trickle down." It's the first time that term was used, the hopes that it would trickle down to the needy. Mr. Hoover didn't know that money actually trickles up. Give it to the poor at the bottom, he says, and the people at the top will have it by midnight. But it will at least, he says, have passed through the hands of the poor. It will at least have passed through the hands of the poor. Cutting taxes for the rich does absolutely nothing for the poor. Money does not trickle down, it actually trickles up. At least if we give it to the poor. The rich will still have it by midnight, but it will at least have passed through the hands of the poor. Pope Francis says of this, "Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion," says Pope Francis, "which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralised working of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting." Why should we continue with this idea of trickle-down economics, giving more money to the rich while denying it to the poor, when there is no evidence that brings about a more just society? 2,000 years ago, Jesus tells a story that typifies human nature when it comes to extreme wealth. This man comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." Jesus' response is, "Why do you make me a judge over you?" And then he tells a story. And the reason he tells a story, not just to the man that asked the question, but to the whole crowd. And I would like to think that the man who asked the question, his brother is also there in the crowd. So Jesus tells this story, and Jesus tells a story to make the crowd the judge. Don't make me the judge, he says. I'm going to tell you a story. And that story is going to make you think. It's going to make you make a decision. It's turning you, the crowd, into the judge. And he tells this story about this rich man who realises that he has so much wealth that he can't fit it in his barns. So he orders that the barns, the old barns, be torn down and build bigger ones. And then he sees his barns full of all this grain, all this wealth. And he sits back. And he doesn't talk to his community about, look at all this wealth I've got, what can we do with it? He doesn't acknowledge the traditions of his people, which says that you even have to not harvest the edges of your field. That is to be left for the poor to come and pick their own grain. He's harvested his fields. He's drug it into his barns. He doesn't have a conversation with anyone else. And this story is told in the way he has his conversation. And he says to his soul, he says to himself, he has this conversation with himself. I know what I will do, self. I will tear down my barns and I will build bigger ones. And I will say to my soul, I will say to myself, I have wealth for many years. I will sit back, I will eat, I will drink, and I will be merry. It is the conversation of narcissism. It is the conversation of self-centeredness. It's not a conversation that gets challenged by anybody who might be poor or marginalised or oppressed. It's the conversation that is totally blind to the needs of others, but only hearing our own desires, our own wants. I say to my soul, soul, I know what I will do. And it is the cause of so much pain and so much suffering in our world. It is that narcissistic voice that says, I know what I need. Let's not worry about anybody else. St. Cassian often wrote about his monks, and all his monks had renounced the world, renounced wealth. Often the monks came from very wealthy families, and they renounced all their wealth. And he said it was so interesting. All these men had renounced all their wealth, all the things of the world, and they would become so obsessed by one little thing. They would get so angry if someone borrowed their prayer book and didn't return it. They would get so angry if they couldn't find their habit. They would get so angry if one little bit of bread went missing. And he would say that the outer renunciation of wealth isn't really the issue. That's not what works for monks. But it's the inner attachment to things. It's the inner renunciation of material things that really matters. So it's not just about what goes on out here in our wealthy lives. And I remind people that even if you are on the aged pension, you are among the top 10% of the world's wealthy. If you are on the average wage, like clergy are, you are among the top 1% of the world's wealthy. So the question is, how do we have that conversation? Do we move away from that narcissistic conversation and say, oh, I haven't got enough, what am I going to do with what little I have? Or do we realise how wealthy we are and have that inner renunciation of our attachments to our things? This woman once came to Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was known as a pretty hard-line kind of person about all kinds of things. And this very wealthy Hindu woman came to Mother Teresa wearing a sari that was worth 800 rupees. Mother Teresa wore a sari worth 8 rupees. So you can imagine how expensive this woman's clothes were. And she came to Mother Teresa and said, 2 things I want to talk to you about, Mother Teresa. And one is that I would like to help. I appreciate the work you're doing for the poor, and I would like to help. But I need to confess that I have an addiction. And my addiction is to beautiful clothes. I just can't get enough of beautiful clothes. I spend 800 rupees on a sari. And Mother Teresa looked at her with compassion and said, well, how about we do this? How about next time you go shopping, you only spend 500 rupees on your sari, remembering that Mother Teresa's sari only cost 8 rupees. So go and spend 500 on a sari. But spend 300 on saris for poor women. So this woman went off, and when she next bought her sari, she reduced the price and paid 500 for it, and then spent 300 on this whole truckload of saris for poor women in Calcutta, and took it to Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa gratefully received that. And she said, well, what else can I do? She said, well, perhaps next time you go shopping, you only spend 300 rupees on your sari. And spend 500 rupees on saris for poor women. And so off she went. And this woman, having an addictive personality, got so addicted to this that next time she went to the shop, she spent 100 rupees on her own sari and 700 rupees on saris for the poor. And Mother Teresa eventually had to say, look, you live in a world of wealth. You live in a world of privilege. You actually need to wear nice clothes. It's how you function in the world you live in. So I want you to promise me that you'll never spend less than 100 rupees on a sari. But when you go and buy your nice sari, remember the poor and buy some saris for some poor women as well. So it's not a bad thing that we live well. And we do live well. We live in nice houses, and we drive nice clothes, and we wear nice cars, and we wear nice clothes. That's not bad. We're not being called to that Franciscan renunciation of everything. We have to live in the society in which we live. But we are being called to the renunciation of the attachments to those things. And it is when we renounce the attachments, and when we see material things for what they really are. This is what this story says. This man has this conversation with himself, and I know I'll store up all these riches, I'll sit back, I'll eat, drink and be merry, for I have years' worth of comfort. He has this conversation with his soul. And then Jesus goes on to say, this night your soul will be required of you. And what will be? All these barns full of grain, but nothing. We need to hear those words in the midst of our wealth and our comfort. What if tonight our soul is required of us? What will all these things be worth? And I can guarantee that if we have to answer that question, the things of most value will be the things that we have given away. The things of most value will be the blessing we have given to others with our wealth. Things of most value will not be the things that we have stored up, because those things are transient. But the things that we have given away, the comfort we have given to others, are eternal. There is a Christian ethicist that says, everything that we have more than we need, everything that we have more than we need, and what we need to function can vary from society to society. In this society, most of us have to work, and we need to get from A to B, so generally it requires some form of transport to do that. So that there is a certain level of possession that we often need to function in our jobs and in our world. We need certain clothes and all that kind of thing. So we need to be sensible about this. But he does say that everything that we have more than we need is stolen from the poor. Is stolen from the poor. So perhaps we need to do an audit. And perhaps we need to understand what we have and what part of what we have is actually stolen from the poor. There's a wonderful story, Barchester Chronicles, Barchester Towers. I don't know if some of you may be familiar. And there are two characters in Barchester Chronicles. One is the dean of this cathedral close, Dean Hardy, a wonderful, gentle old man. And then there's the old bishop, Bishop Grantley. And Dean Hardy and Bishop Grantley get together regularly, and they'll have wonderful conversations about all kind of lofty things. And at the end of their conversation, they'll always quote Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, thus saith the preacher. And the other will respond, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And these two wonderful old mythical ecclesiologues will be recognising that all these lofty things in their conversation is really nothing but air. Nothing but bubbles, because that the word we translate out of Hebrew into vanity can be translated as bubbles. Nothing is more than bubbles. And it recognises the transience of all the things that we value. These days at weddings, we don't like confetti. Of course, we've got to clean it up afterwards, so we encourage people to use bubbles. They look wonderful in the photos, and the kids love them. The kids will run around after the wedding blowing the bubbles. And we need to learn what children know, is that bubbles are only of value when they are shared with others in joy and in generosity and in laughter. That all our possessions are really just bubbles, and that they have their greatest value when they are given away. All that we own, more than we need, is stolen from the poor. The Lord be with you.